World War I began when Gavrilo Princip shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914. Germany fought on two fronts, eastern and western, where modern methods were used. Trench warfare, large tanks, mustard gas, and maritime warfare was common. America had previously been neutral, but after Germany sank their ships, President Woodrow Wilson declared war against Germany on April 2, 1917. This decision led to social upheaval throughout America, resulting in a revolutionary change of gender roles in the workplace.
While men were fighting on the front lines, women had to uphold traditionally masculine industries in order to keep the economy afloat. They participated in labor-intensive blue-collar jobs. The clothing they had previously worn proved to be hazardous in these new working environments, leading to fashion reforms that showed women the rights they were missing. Women's health was severely compromised with their old clothing as well, as they commonly wore restrictively tight corsets. Although this was a foreign concept at the time, not many men opposed the idea of women in the workplace because of the importance of their economic role. Female American pioneers took advantage of the labor-intensive jobs necessary during World War I to cross a fashion frontier that was solely made possible by the war.
Women's clothing before the war was confining and inadequate for the upcoming physically demanding tasks that they had to perform during the war. Before the war, women wore frilly dresses with wide skirts made from rich materials. They commonly had cinched corsets and promoted an hourglass figure. The fashion world had an extremely narrow vision when it came to women's fashion. Their extravagant dresses were expected to have an abnormally small waist and a large dress skirt. These pieces featured an excessive amount of fabric that compromised their ability to complete tasks that were newly implemented because of the war. Maury Chisholm, an ambulance driver during World War I, mentioned that it was a man's world, so women dressed to please the male gaze. Maury mentions,
and of course we were not brought up to careers at all.
When their clothing was made, there was no intention of women having to work, so when the war came along, it made things difficult. Although the extravagant fabrics and materials added to the desired look of their wardrobes, women were unable to complete these tasks. Without these new occupations that emerged during the war, women would not have had the opportunity to cross the barricade of restrictive women's fashion.
Health reformers were also concerned about the harmful health effects that this clothing had on women. When trying to reach the standard of a delicate physique with dangerous clothing, their health was compromised and affected negatively. Many pioneers chose to take part in feminist health reforms regarding women's fashion. Male doctors even supported this movement. As they wore less confining clothing during the war, women's health wasn't compromised as much as it had been in the past with such dangerous apparel. World War I allowed women to expand their perspective regarding their rights behind their clothing.
Pioneers in women's fashion had hoped that women would be able to spend more time participating in physical activities, but their previous wardrobes prevented them from moving freely. Women were barely able to take part in everyday activities because of the historically confining clothing. During the war, they were needed in labor-intensive positions that they had never participated in before. Since the men were gone, the women took their place in these jobs which required much more than moving freely, leading to an inevitable change in their unnecessarily restrictive wardrobe. The restrictive clothing before the war made it impossible for women to complete their daily tasks, nevertheless the labor-intensive jobs that were soon to come.
Without labor-intensive jobs that called for women to take men's previous positions, the positive alteration of women's fashion would have never occurred, leading to more inclusive clothing being introduced. Mills implemented restrictions on women's clothing as they posed a danger around the machinery. These previously popular pieces of clothing began to be prohibited in the workplace. Hoop skirts would have been highly dangerous, and they would have restricted workers' productivity, leading to less economic benefit overall. The business owners placed these constraints to benefit them economically, but this implementation positively impacted women's rights regarding fashion, as women did not have to wear the same constraining clothing that they always had.
A classic woman's uniform was a simple jacket and a long princess robe, all made of wool. Before the war, women's clothing would have never been described as simple, as it was the furthest thing from it. Each piece of clothing featured loads of extra fabric to make the clothing seem more extravagant. However, here, the new uniform is being described to fit the woman's new responsibilities in the workplace. With a more simple design, women's clothing was more similar to men's clothing in the workplace during World War I.
When working in factories and agricultural occupations, women created uniforms by taking men's clothes and tweaking them. Women's daily clothing became more modernized to help keep costs down in the fluctuating economy. Men's clothing was the only attire available that would appropriately fit the jobs that women had to take over while the men were away at war. The inclusion of pants in women's wardrobes signified their drive for change when they adapted men's clothing to work around their body types. Women would not have been able to work in the clothing that they had worn before the war, so this change was necessary. With the newly configured outfits necessary for women to complete these laborious jobs, women began to feel a glimmer of hope for the expansion of their clothing rights in the future.
Frontiers were crossed in women's fashion during the Great War as female pioneers overcame unfair clothing expectations that were prevalent for years prior. Women began sharing equal rights with men in the clothing department. Women longed for a change in their rights because they had close to none compared to all the rights that men had. Women utilized the change in clothing as a way to correct this problem and gain more rights. Women were allowed to wear the same clothing as men, and they were not as restricted by what they could or could not wear. Without the war, they would have never been able to achieve this monumental step. The need of women in the workforce further proved that women could do the same jobs as men, so they should be treated and have the same rights that men had at the time.
Due to less restrictive clothing, women began participating in athletics that they previously could not take part in. They began to escape restrictions like the corset. Before the war, women were unable to participate in physical activities because of the discomfort and restrictions that their clothing brought at the time. With the reforms brought with World War I, they were finally able to escape the stereotypical clothing they were forced to wear as they began to experiment with self-expression more. They were able to leave the uncomfortable corset in the past, along with the restrictions that came along with it to perform tasks during the war. Female pioneers participated in athletics and continued to strive for more rights because of this reform.
After the war, women's clothing became more practical, with sleeves that were short and a neckline that was cut low. Women did not have any freedom for self-expression through fashion or style before the war. To progress their rights after the war, women designed their new wardrobe to become less modest and embrace their freedom by showing more skin. Some women chose to even cut their hair. What these pioneers accomplished could have been seen as an act of rebellion against the rights men took away from them in the past regarding fashion. By going against previous restrictions, women clearly crossed a frontier in their clothing rights. After the war, women were able to escape the majority of the barriers and restrictions that clothing had put on them by continuing to change their wardrobes as time went on.
Because of World War I, women did not continue to wear restrictive clothing that made them unable to complete laborious jobs during World War I, as well as pastimes that they participated in for entertainment purposes. Female American pioneers utilized their new places in society during World War I to cross a frontier in women's fashion, later leading to the expansion of their general rights. This was only made possible because of the war, because women may not have had the opportunity otherwise. World War I provided the ability for pioneers to take an important step in the march towards women's rights. They began to see more women in the workforce and overall more self-expression amongst women. This self-expression can be seen through flappers in the 1920s. These young women had a lot of energy, freedom, and a borderline immoral lifestyle, so they were seen as the first generation of independent American women. Their independence expanded into the work field as they continued to work with higher-paying wages, leading to further fashion reforms. Short dresses, pants, and athletic wear began to emerge.
Soon after, the media began to recognize that women were not solely interested in household tasks. They wanted to participate in the same things that men were allowed to do, which furthered their motivation to expand their rights. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women gained the right to vote that they deserved many years before, showing the progression of women's rights that took place at the time. Female pioneers raided and fought for the right to vote despite the criticism that they received from men. These bold and courageous acts inspired other women to stand up for the rights they believed in as well.
Ruby Ord, for example, was a clerk in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corporation before women got the right to vote in 1920.
I really learned to admire women. I admired them tremendously.
These pioneers' actions inspired countless women to take action, leading to the necessary reformation of the female role in society.
We look for love, no time for tears, waste wasted waters